Do no harm to the environment, and take nothing from the earth that is not easily renewed by the earth. This was the mantra of Ray Anderson, the late CEO of Interface Inc., a global carpet company. In 1994, Anderson stood before the employees of his company and posed this challenge to them. He stated the mantra and asked them to commit to what he called Mission Zero, a mission to transform their company into a model of sustainable green business with zero environmental footprint. But how could a single man running a synthetic carpet company, a product largely created by oil, transform his product and his business practices so they did no harm to the environment? Anderson's story is a great example of how one man's personal transformation can revolutionize an entire industry. At the age of 60, Anderson read Paul Hawken's book, The Ecology of Commerce, a Declaration of Sustainability. The book convinced him that his business was pillaging the earth, and that as a result, he was not a hero of industry, but a villain who was robbing from the next generation. Rather than take this as criticism, Anderson took it as a challenge, and he extended that challenge to his employees. He challenged them to work together and transform how they did business by using technology to climb Mount Sustainability. Throughout the mission, or climb as he called it, he set difficult goals for his company, encouraged and supported employees as they experimented with new technology, and used inspiring imagery of climbing a summit and transforming industry. In other words, he used influence to alter his company and set new standards for how businesses should be run. What progress did Anderson's company make in their climb up Mount Sustainability? Well, between 1996 and 2008, Interface Inc. reduced its greenhouse gas emissions by 82%, while dramatically increasing sales and doubling profits. Interface also reduced fossil fuel use by 60% per unit of production, and the company managed to cut water usage by 75%. It's hard to get your head around these accomplishments because it's hard to imagine how so many good things could come from this effort. Interface has grown substantially. It makes more money for its owners and investors than ever before, and at the same time, it has dramatically improved in how ecologically friendly it is. By all accounts, Anderson is a leader. He used his formal position and his passion and lots of influence techniques to get his employees to change what they were doing. And he didn't stop there. He wrote 2 books and appeared in numerous interviews, was profiled in many newspaper and magazine articles, and even spoke a few years before his death at a 2009 TED conference. In his talk, he summarized his philosophy, his story, and the company's accomplishments. He also discussed how his employees were embracing higher purpose in their work lives. What this means is that Anderson didn't stop his work at the doors of his company. He leveraged its success to become an active and effective spokesperson throughout the business world. In this lecture, we will discuss leadership and influence, specifically what differentiates leaders like Ray Anderson from more traditional corporate managers. And then we'll explore what Anderson's example has to teach us about becoming influential leaders in our own right. Let's start with a quick review of some theory and research on leadership. For many years, leadership research focused on what has been called the great man theory. Scholars pose the question, what traits make some people great leaders and others poor leaders or not leaders at all? They tested whether leaders were smarter, taller, more sociable, more likable, and so on. What they found was that there are some key differences on average between those who emerge as leaders and those who do not. But more recent studies have discovered something that matters even more than individual traits. What matters most, according to the latest research, is the nature of the relationship between the leader and her followers. In a major synthesis of prior research, a 2011 article in the journal Personnel Psychology examines different types of leadership and their relationships with leadership outcomes. What do I mean by leadership outcomes? Well, they include follower satisfaction with the leader, follower motivation, follower job performance, follower judgment about the leader's effectiveness, and ultimately the performance of the group or organization that followers are a part of. The researchers, Tim Judge and Ron Piccolo, found that the best predictor of these outcomes overall was a particular style of leadership called transformational leadership. The concept of transformational leadership comes from a political historian, James MacGregor Burns. Burns, professor emeritus at Williams College, has written a number of books on presidential history and received a Pulitzer for his book on President Franklin Delano Roosevelt. In a subsequent book about leadership more generally, Burns argued that different leaders develop different types of relationships with their followers. Specifically, he distinguished between transactional and transformational leaders. Transactional leadership occurs when the relationship between followers and leaders is based on exchange that meets each party's needs. Followers do what the leader wants in exchange for something they want. Burns cites the Stoic philosopher Epictetus, who wrote, "No one is afraid of Caesar himself, but he is afraid of death, loss of property, prison, and disenfranchisement. Nor does anyone love Caesar himself, but we love wealth." In other words, the relationship between the senators and Caesar was based on influence through rewards and punishment. You do what Caesar wants, and you get what you want. In everyday work life, you see this play out with supervisors who try to influence their employees to work harder by threat, pick up the pace or lose your job, or by reward. If you pick up the pace, you'll earn a bonus. That's transactional leadership. Transformational leadership is different. It occurs when the relationship between followers and leaders is based on influence through values and ideals. Burns uses many examples of this type of leadership in his book, including Franklin Delano Roosevelt, who established a New Deal for the American people, and Mahatma Gandhi, who established the first Indian state by freeing his people from the British Empire. Let's look at Roosevelt for a minute. Roosevelt was certainly a great tactical politician. He was not above trading favors to get votes. But when it came time to sell his New Deal to Congress and the American people, he spent a great deal of time and effort thinking through how to inspire support for this enormous initiative. Roosevelt argued, necessitous men are not free men, which connected the concept of freedom to proposed programs to create jobs, medical care, and retirement income. He also referred to these programs as a New Deal, akin to a second Bill of Rights. Roosevelt was trying to inspire support of these programs by connecting them to the original U.S. Constitution and to the core value of freedom. By offering these connections, Roosevelt was building a relationship with followers based on higher-order principles and ideals. That's the essence of transformational leadership. You might ask whether the concept of transformational leadership applies outside of politics. Well, the answer is absolutely yes. For example, many business scholars have been influenced by Burns's book. In particular, Bernie Bass and Bruce Avolio took Burns's ideas and extended them to the study of business leaders. They went so far as to write survey instruments and collect detailed data about the different aspects of leadership and its consequences. Bass and Avolio suggest that transformational leadership has 4 dimensions. idealized influence, inspirational motivation, intellectual stimulation, and individualized consideration. This model has been studied extensively and has been labeled the 4 I's of transformational leadership. Let's discuss each of these dimensions. Idealized influence occurs when leaders accept that they are role models and behave in admirable ways. Leaders like this display passion and conviction and so appeal to their followers on an emotional level. Inspirational motivation requires that the leader develop and promote a vision that captures people's hearts and minds. The vision must be positive and provide meaning to the hard work that's being asked of followers. Intellectual stimulation requires that the leader challenge the status quo and involve followers in developing ideas. Leaders who do this well engage their followers in pushing forward their shared cause. Finally, individualized consideration requires that the leader listen to her followers, acknowledge their concerns and needs, and support them. To make these 4 I's of transformational leadership more concrete, let's revisit Ray Anderson. Anderson did not attempt to motivate his employees by saying, "If we cut expenses, I'll share profits with you," or by arguing that their jobs were at stake if they couldn't reduce the company's greenhouse emissions. Instead, Anderson used inspirational motivation by appealing to the lofty goal of saving the planet for the next generation, of finding new and better ways to do business. He was appealing not to their pocketbooks, but to their hearts, minds, and souls. And Anderson used idealized influence as well. He was a role model for Mission Zero. He put his money where his mouth was. He personally committed a good deal of time and money to those efforts to alter his business. He spent a considerable amount of his time outside of the business writing and speaking about the environment. And when he built a vacation home later in his career, he built it using the most environmentally friendly technology at the time, with the goal, 0 environmental impact. In short, Anderson's personal behavior was a critical element in his overall attempt to influence his employees. You can also see how Anderson used intellectual stimulation. He didn't tell his employees how to become environmentally friendly. He challenged them to figure it out. He had very high expectations, and he turned over considerable decision-making power to his employees so they could test out new ideas. And finally, Anderson displayed individualized consideration by recognizing people for their ideas and efforts. If you think about it, Anderson, when he was giving all these talks, could have taken all the credit for the initiatives and accomplishments of the company. But he regularly and routinely made mention of how important Hawkins' thinking had been to Interface's transformation. In fact, Anderson and Hawkins appear to have developed a great relationship based on mutual respect. Hawkins even dedicated a revision of one of his classic books to Anderson. So in Ray Anderson, we see how a leader who adopts the 4 I's can make a big difference in the world. Transformational leaders do exactly what the label suggests. They transform people, and through those people, help build a better world. None of this should be interpreted to mean that transactional leadership is not useful. As Burns himself notes in his book, both types of leadership are useful. And research bears this out as well. The study I mentioned earlier by Tim Judge and Ron Piccolo found that transactional leadership works too. In fact, a few outcomes were higher for transactional than transformational leaders, including the follower's job satisfaction and the job performance of the leader. These results actually point to the idea that transactional leaders may be quite effective in helping their employees understand what to do, with the clarity improving subsequent satisfaction. These leaders may also be better at doing what is required of them in their core job requirements. Transformational leaders are not necessarily bad at doing these things, but it's easy to picture a transformational leader focusing on the grand vision at the expense of the everyday operational details. The value of transformational leaders, then, is not their ability to get basic things done, but in their capacity to gather others together and lead change. Okay, so we've distinguished between transactional and transformational leaders. And I've explained how people like Ray Anderson use the 4 I's to influence his company's employees and their industry peers. Now it's worth moving to the long-standing question of whether these types of leaders are born or made. Is transformational leadership something you're born into, or is it a skill that we can develop and apply in our daily lives? Queen's University's Julian Barling and his colleagues did a study that helps us answer this question. They provided transformational leadership training to a group of bank managers. To study whether the training worked, the researchers actually offered the training to half of the managers and tested to see whether their leadership behaviors changed and whether the performance of the branches where they work changed as well. They identified 20 branch managers working in the same bank and same region. Trained managers attended a workshop and received follow-up coaching sessions by an expert in transformational leadership. The ultimate test of any leadership training should not be what happens to the leaders, but what happens to their employees. Employees of trained managers showed increases in commitment to the bank. And they worked harder, generating more sales than they had before their manager had been trained. There was no change in employees of non-trained managers. So using this ultimate test, this training, transformational leadership training, made a big difference for the bank branches. These results offer a clear indication that while we may not all have a Ray Anderson hidden within us, we can all become more of a transformational leader in our approach dealing with others. The training that Barling and his colleagues used was not mystical. They explained to managers what it means to use idealized influence and inspirational motivation, and they asked those people to practice. I've worked with bank managers before, and they're not typically the most dynamic and persuasive group. So I have to say, if they can do it, you can too. John Antonakis and his colleagues at the University of Lausanne conducted research leading to the same conclusion. For their study, the researchers videotaped 41 business students giving speeches. Then they trained the students how to be more transformational in their speaking style, using stories, symbols, and vivid language that elicits emotion. Remember our lecture on making speeches? These ideas should sound familiar. When the same students were taped after training, and those tapes were shown to over 100 independent raters, the speakers were found to be much more engaging and convincing. I find these results inspiring. I've worked with thousands of students over the years, and many wonder whether they can ever lead others. The answer is, if they choose to do so and are willing to learn, they and you absolutely can. I hasten to add that some of my students don't necessarily enjoy managing others. So if that's the case, they should stop and think before they take a promotion with management responsibility. But whether an individual is in a management position or not, if they choose to do so, they can lead. Let's remember that transformational leadership is about a relationship, not just about a single person standing on a stage giving a speech. And with a relationship, there are many complexities that arise. One of those complexities occurs in the interpretation of the leader's motives. When you see someone telling a story and setting herself up to be a symbol of change, appealing to the emotion of others to join her, what things go through your mind? One of the questions you might have is, Why? Are this person's motives for leading really value-based and idealized? Or are we being deceived by someone with a thirst for power and a Machiavellian personality? Some people have personal histories that answer these questions. Stephanie Yorgis and her colleagues tested whether leaders who had shown a willingness to sacrifice for their beliefs would be seen as more influential. What Yorgis found is that past sacrifice does make a difference in how leaders are perceived. People who sacrificed in the past are more likely to be given the benefit of the doubt in their motives. This probably explains the success of so many military figures in political life. They sacrifice to serve their country, and as a result, their motives are less open to criticism. Setting military figures aside, we find many transformational leaders whose past sacrifice serves as a strong foundation for subsequent efforts to influence and persuade. The Burmese activist Aung San Suu Kyi comes to mind, as of course does the man I mentioned briefly in the opening lecture of this course, Nelson Mandela. As a leading figure in the African National Congress, the ANC, Mandela had stood in opposition to the racist apartheid system since its inception in 1948. Initially, he favored nonviolent tactics, but in the face of ongoing repression, he changed his mind. In 1955, he claimed publicly that the ANC had, quote, no alternative to armed and violent resistance. This decision and his subsequent actions led to Mandela's arrest in 1962 and the banning of the ANC as a political party. In 1964, Mandela was found guilty of conspiracy to overthrow the government and was sentenced to life in prison. Mandela was initially imprisoned in a concrete cell measuring 7 by 8 feet and spent his days in hard labor. Even so, he stayed politically active and was involved in politicking and hunger strikes. In total, Mandela spent 27 years in prison, where he suffered permanent damage to his eyesight and at one point caught tuberculosis. But he also continued to build a reputation and learn, earning a law degree and learning Afrikaans, the language spoken by the whites in South Africa. In 1990, the new white leader of South Africa, Frederick de Klerk, decided that apartheid was unsustainable, and he met with Mandela. After the meeting, de Klerk freed Mandela unconditionally and lifted the ban on the ANC. Much of the ensuing 2 years was spent in formal negotiation between de Klerk's government and Mandela's ANC as they attempted to dismantle apartheid. A free election with whites and blacks free to vote was set for April 1994. Now, given that the vast majority of the South African population is black, it wasn't a surprise that Mandela was elected president and began work on what many consider to be his lasting legacy. Although Mandela had embraced violence earlier in his life, he came out strongly for national reconciliation. He used inspirational language and set himself up as a role model. He referred to South Africa as the Rainbow Nation and brought whites into his governing cabinet. He also sought to bring the nation together by convincing blacks to get behind the national rugby team, the Springboks, which up until that time had been despised by blacks. In a series of events made famous by movies like Invictus, Mandela used rugby as a symbol of reconciliation. And when South Africa won the Rugby World Cup in 1995, he actually presented the championship trophy to Captain Francois Pienaar while wearing a Springboks jersey. Recall from Yorgis's work that sacrifices make leaders even more influential. In Mandela's case, he had sacrificed nearly everything to the advancement of political rights for blacks in South Africa. Following the collapse of apartheid, there were some who called for war and justice by jailing the oppressors. Mandela, however, had a higher goal in mind, and largely because of his credibility, his reputation, and stature as a man who had sacrificed for the cause, he was able to convince his countrymen to join him in pursuit of that higher goal. He used inspirational motivation by focusing attention on symbols of unity, like the rainbow and the Springbok jersey. And he used idealized influence by modeling forgiveness, forgiving the politicians and even the jailers who held him captive over those many years. Were it not for Mandela's transformational leadership, South Africa may well have descended into civil war rather than move peacefully forward toward national unity and economic prosperity. Mandela is a fantastic example of just how much is possible with transformational leadership. Transformational leaders establish a vision and use all the influence tactics they can to encourage others to join them in pursuit. Not many of us have sacrificed the way that Mandela sacrificed, but it is still possible to use your past history to convince people that your motives are good ones when you go to lead. I remember a senior administrator who interviewed at the University of Iowa a while back. He came to interview from the West Coast after having been a senior administrator at 3 other universities. To some of us, it felt a bit like he was just working his way up the ladder by moving wherever there were job openings. How did he convince people that his motives for coming to Iowa were something more than just personal ambition? What he did was tell a story about how his first exposure to the United States was when he attended Grinnell College as an undergraduate, and how the people of Iowa made him feel welcome, and how Iowa became to him like a second home. So, to come back and be an administrator at the University of Iowa was, he told us, like coming home again. It would be an opportunity to return the remarkable hospitality he had received as a student. Clearly, attending Grinnell, which is a fantastic liberal arts college about an hour from the University of Iowa, was not a personal sacrifice on his part. But this is a really useful story. This administrator's Grinnell story provided some evidence that his motives for wanting to be a leader at the University of Iowa were not purely selfish. They were driven by a calling to come home and give back. So the point is, you don't have to go to prison to establish yourself as a credible transformational leader. Look to your own personal history for stories that you can use to draw out and convince others of your better motives. So far, we've discussed transformational leadership in some detail, beginning with former CEO Ray Anderson and continuing with former South African President Nelson Mandela. Now let's talk about 2 things you can do to practice influence the way that transformational leaders do it. First, consider an issue or cause that's personally important to you. Are you passionate about the need for more public land in your city or town? Do you think local property taxes are too high? Does the local animal shelter need to expand and buy a new facility? In each case, there is an opportunity for someone like you to be transformative. So pick your cause, reach out to others, build relationships based on common values, interests, and principles, establish a shared vision, and mobilize people to make it happen. What if you don't want to give speeches or act as the formal spokesperson for your chosen cause? Is there another way that you can move forward the ideas in this lecture? Yes. And that leads us to my second suggestion. You can design and plan the influence campaign. To mobilize people's hearts and minds, you can help decide on the ideals and symbols, the stories, and the particular figureheads that will win people over. So your task is to help prepare the influence campaign that must accompany your group's efforts. You may not be the one to deliver the speeches, but you can help build its components, the logos, as we discussed in our lecture on speech building, and the vision and symbols as we've discussed today. Whether as a leader or part of a team, are you ready to use influence to make a change in the world around you? It has been an honor and a privilege, and a whole lot of fun to be with you over the course of these last 12 lectures. I hope that you've learned something that will help you right away. Perhaps what you've learned about the 4 key factors of influence, agent, target, tactics, and context, perhaps that knowledge will help you the next time you're bombarded with influence attempts from advertisers and salespeople. Perhaps keeping the ADDIC acronym in mind, you'll make sure that you're buying what you really need and not what you've been lured into buying. Perhaps it will help you avoid being taken advantage of by someone with negative characteristics of narcissism, Machiavellianism, or psychopathy. More positively, I hope you will be better at selling your own ideas in speeches, interviews, and at the negotiating table. Above all, I hope that what I've talked about here will inspire you. I hope it will inspire you to give transformational leadership a try. By mastering the underlying mechanisms of influence, you are now better prepared to be a transformative force, to change things that happen in your homes, your businesses, and communities. So I encourage you, I challenge you to put what you've learned about influence to use on behalf of a cause that is near and dear to your heart.